Hey guys, today we are in John chapter 4, which is really consumes most of the chapter with Jesus and the Samaritan, right? The woman at the well. A couple things you need to just kind of know before you gonna get into this story, right? If we think of Israel like this pin, okay, you have Galilee, which is at the very top, you have Judea, which is at the very bottom, and right here, kind of almost the middle section, is a country called Samaria. It was the middle part of Israel. About 722, Israel was defeated, and instead of taking them into exile, like they did into Babylon, they really dispersed them. They made them move out. When that happened, a lot of Jews went from the southern region of Israel, which is where Jerusalem is at, Judea, and they dispersed. And they went basically all over the globe, but a big part of them just went north into this area called Samaria. And after a while, these Jews started to not be so Jewish. They started to not live by God's law. They stopped doing some of the things that they would normally do, some of the ceremonial cleansing, some of the rituals. Then they started to intermarry into the Gentiles of that region and really created what we call Samaria right here in Jesus's day. So even though Samaria is a country around Israel, it's a bunch of Jews. Even though they're generational. They were Jews, now they're not. They're very much Gentiles. But they've kind of basically walked away from God through that time. So now in Jesus's time, when the Jews of Israel think of Samaria, they think of traitors, of backstabbers, of people who were not devout to God. And so they literally hated the Samaritan people. And there's many more reasons, but that's kind of the gist, right? So when Jews wanted to travel, you have my pen, right? Here's my pen again. You have Galilee, you have Judea, and Jerusalem, let's say, is right about here. And you have all of this is Samaria. When they want to travel from Galilee, they can't just come straight down. They would never enter in to Samaria because of the traders, because of the belief in them, because of everything that happened in the past. So they had two options, right? They could go straight through, which was the quickest. They could go to the east. They could go to the west. Okay. If they went straight down, it would take about 70 miles to get to Judea, to get to Jerusalem. That's about a 3 or 4 day walk. If they went to the east side, which means they went over the Jordan and they walked down, came into Jericho and then came back in, right? We saw Jesus do that at the end of Luke in the Perean ministry. And so they would walk on the east side of the Jordan and come back in. Instead of the 70 miles to walk this way, this was about 130 miles. This took 10 to 12 day walk, right? So this added basically a week's worth of walking. And that's most of the time, most of the Jews that were going from Galilee to Jerusalem, that's how they would walk. Some would walk on the west side, and they would go all the way over to the Mediterranean Sea and walk down the coast, because it's the coast, it's the best, right? It's a good living, it's nice, lots of big towns and ships and ports and vegetables and all those types of things. And then they would come back in. That was a much better way to walk, but what happened was where this took 70 miles, this was 130 miles. Now this is 160 miles. Where this took 3 to 4 days, this took 7 to 12 days, this took 15 to 20 days. But when we think about this, all you really need to grasp in this is that Jews would never walk through the middle. Even though it was the easiest, they hated the Samaritan people so much that they would never do that. They would always add a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks onto their journey to just walk around Samaria. Now that we have that understanding, we come to the woman at the well. We have woman and this Jesus that talks to this woman, right? And we notice it says he left Judea and he departed again for Galilee. So he's leaving the south part, right? He's leaving down here and he needs to get up here, right? And so what happens? And he had to pass through Samaria. Now, that's an interesting word there in verse 4. He had to pass through Samaria. For some reason, and we find out in this chapter, right, that there was a reason he had to walk through there. No good Jew walks through there. This wasn't an accident. He knew that he had a godly, divine appointment, and he needed to meet that. So he goes through Samaria. Now, the whole time, we have to remember, he's called some disciples. These disciples are following him. And the whole time, these disciples are probably just going nuts. They're going crazy that they have to walk through Samaria. They probably have never in their life walked through this. And they're thinking, oh my goodness, we're going to have to cleanse. People's going to think we're less. We're not real Jews. I mean, they're probably just going on and on and on the whole way, right? But this is what Jesus wants to do. And they go through, they come to a city named Sychar. Sychar is where Jacob's well is. We can find that story in Genesis chapter 33. Genesis chapter 33, Jesus is there, and it says it was about the 6th hour. It was noon. It's the hottest part of the day. And guess what? Jesus is thirsty. Fully God, fully man, right? He's thirsty. He needed something to drink. And a woman coming to the well at noon meets Jesus there. Now, there's some things that you have to kind of know culture and just read into. Nobody likes to work in the hottest part of the day. That's just not what we like to do, right? We like to work in the cool parts of the day. And so this woman coming by herself in the hottest part of the day shows us that she's not the best of women. She's not the one that has lots of friends, because probably early in the morning when it was still cool, all the women came to the well and they gathered water. But here's this woman coming by herself, no protection, in the hottest part of the day. So it just giving us a little kind of just, we don't know what, we find out what it is in a little bit, but it just kind of sets the tone that this single woman comes to the well by herself in the hottest part of the day. And Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." Now, what's interesting is it says Jesus said to her. Jesus initiated the conversation. A Jew would have never, ever, ever initiated a conversation with the Samaritan. It would have been frowned upon. It would have been bad. There's lots of things that would have happened. But we see here that even though she's a Samaritan, Jesus still loves her. This is the reason why Jesus went through Samaria. He had to go. It was for this woman, right? And so he asked for a drink of water, and she's in unbelief that a Jew would even talk to her. And Jesus answered, said, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would ask him, and he would have given you living water." This is an important word, living water. This is an Old Testament metaphor. When we see the words living water in the Old Testament, it is talking about salvation. You got to think, they're in a desert. To have a place with living water, think of a spring bubbling up from the ground, it would mean that they were saved, right? They wouldn't have to dig wells. They wouldn't have to do anything. Water was everything when you live in the desert. And so in the Old Testament, we have prophets like Ezekiel, Jeremiah, who use the term of living water, and it's always referring to salvation. And Jesus is using that metaphor, and he's saying, if you would have known who you were asking for, you would have been given living water. You would be giving salvation. Jesus is offering salvation. In verse 14, it says, "But whoever drinks of this water I give him will never be thirsty again." Once again, this context of living water, of salvation. And then we see this in the Samaritan woman in verse 15 saying, "Sir, give me this water. Give me this salvation. Give me this." But Jesus does something, right? That's a great story in verse 15, and you can almost end it there. But Jesus does something in verse 16 that, as we're reading it, might seem a little weird. She says, "Sir, give me this salvation." And instantly in verse 16, Jesus said, "Go call your husband and come here." Why did he do that? Why didn't he give her salvation? Oh, maybe he wants to meet her husband. Maybe he wants to bring the salvation to family. It's because Jesus is God. Jesus knew the heart of that woman. Jesus knew that she said, "Oh, I want salvation," but she really didn't want salvation. She was trying to find salvation in something else, not in the Messiah, not in the Son of God, not in the living water, but she was trying to find salvation in men. Men that would say that they would love her and they would wanted to be with her, they would keep her. And that's why he said, "Hey, go call your husband." And the woman answered him, "I have no husband." And Jesus said, "You're right. You have had 5 husbands, and the man you're living with is not even your husband now." This woman is seeking salvation everywhere but through God, right? And God needed to bring that out. Jesus needed to bring that out so that she could fully see and understand what the living water is, right? She says, "Oh, you're a prophet. I perceive that you're a prophet. Oh my goodness, this is crazy. This is a miracle." And then she says in verse 25, the woman said to him, "I know the Messiah is coming," right? Remember, she's not a Jew. Her ancestors are Jew, and she knows enough of the Jewish heritage living in Israel, even though she's in Samaria. Knowing this, "I know the Messiah is coming, he who is called the Messiah, the Christ, the Christos. When he comes, he will tell us all things," right? So even to the Samaritan woman, she believes that the Messiah is not just for Israel, but for her also. And Jesus said to her, "I who speak to you am he." This is the first time in the book of John that Jesus says that he is the Messiah. He is the Son of the God. He is the one that has been prophesied about in the Old Testament. And he said, "I am the Messiah." And then the disciples come back. They see her talking to this woman. They can't really comprehend what's going on because they're Jews. They think about Samaritans another way, right? And so the woman left with the water jar, went into the town, and said to the people, what did she say? It's funny. It's the same words that Jesus said to the disciples. "Come and see. Come, see a man who told me that all that I ever did. Can this be the Christos? Can this be the disciple?" They went out of town and they were coming to him. And so this idea of coming to the Messiah, right? But while they're coming, while she's going back and testifying to what she has seen and heard with Jesus, the disciples have their own little conversation amongst themselves, right? And they're saying, "Hey, eat. Hey, you need to do this. Jesus, you need to take care of yourself." And Jesus says, "No, I've got my own food." And disciples are trying to, who gave him food? I didn't give him food. Peter, did you give him food? Did you give him food, Andrew? No. Who gave him food? And he said, "My food is what God wants me to do. I've come to do the will of the Father." And he said, do you not say, there are 4 months, then comes the harvest? Look, I tell you, lift up your eyes and see that the fields are white for harvest. This idea of the disciples going, right? They're going to follow. They're going to tell people about the Messiah. He's saying, don't you dare say that, oh, in a few months, right? Oh, when we get back to the Jewish communities, when we get back to Galilee, we can tell people and people will be saved. He said, don't you dare. There are people right here. There's people right here. The Gentiles, the Samaritans, they need to be saved. The fields are white for harvest. And just saying that they need to be ready, right? And he's saying that you're going to see a blessing. You're going to see people come to Christ, and you didn't sow the seeds. Jesus sowed the seeds, but they're going to see the blessing. They're going to see the fruit of that. And it says that Jesus stayed for 2 days, verse 43, and then he departed for Galilee. And then we get to kind of the tail end of chapter 4 when he enters into Galilee. He comes back to Cana. This is where he did the water into wine, the first miracle. But now we see the second miracle of Jesus. The second miracle also happens in Cana. It's a very small town. If you've been there, I mean, it's not very big at all. It's a street, really. It's all it really is. But the second sign is there, and a man came and he said, "Hey, my kid is sick. Can you come and see him?" And Jesus said, "Go, your son is healed." And the man believed the words that Jesus spoke. Right? He hasn't seen the miracles. He has heard of what Jesus did in Jerusalem, but this man hasn't heard of what Jesus could do. He hasn't heard of the healings. He hasn't heard of all this because those things haven't happened yet. Jesus here on the second miracle goes and he says, this man believes the words and he starts heading back. And one of his workers comes and meets him and says, "Your son is getting better." And he said, "What time?" And he was like, "Oh, at 1 o'clock yesterday." And he said, "That was the same time that Jesus said that your son will live." And he himself believed, and all of his household. So this miracle changed his life, changed his family life, probably became disciples of Jesus, followed after Jesus. And it says that was the second sign. That was the second miracle, the wedding at Cana and now the healing at Cana. And so hope that makes sense. I know you can spend a great deal of time at the woman at the well, and we just kind of skimmed over it. But there's a lot there. And if you enjoy that story, I encourage you to dig into that. But we will see you tomorrow on chapter 5. God bless.